Hi with you, and let's break down the reference and the animation. So let's start with breaking out reference. The reference. So first of all, why does this animation work so well? There are several reasons for that. And the first is that it has very nice anticipation that you used in your animation. So we have several frames. First we have the stars, they appear, then we have blinking frame where they disappear, then you can see they appear in a different spot, but it's not entirely random. If you look closely, this one goes to the left, this one increases in size, this one turns into particles, then we've got new ones, then this one becomes smaller, and these ones visually move a little bit down, and this one increases in size. So you notice a pattern here. So we start, we give it some time, then we change it, but we keep some of them changing slowly. So some of them stay at the same position but increase in size or disappear. Again, these ones disappear, this one goes here and becomes smaller, and this one goes here. And they slowly expand. So it starts like this, expands to the right, to the left, expands vertically, and starts giving more stars here, or some indication of stars. Then this one turns into a proper star, and we've got some stars on the right and on the left far side. Then again, this moves here, this moves down, this becomes bigger, moves here, 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 and then we create a big general shape. So again, it stretches vertically, and then it comes back and focuses its energy. Then we have 3 frames of nothing, and then we have very contrast frames. So the lightning starts here, so it is illuminated from the bottom, then the light is behind these trees, so the contrast moves closer to the camera. So it goes contrast here, contrast down, contrast back into the center. But yet again, you see, this area is kept the same. It's just these trees become stretched out, and these trees become stretched out and darker. And we have 3 trees, 4 frames that are very high in contrast. So you get 1, 2, 3, 4, explosion, and you see the overall shape is already there. Then it concentrates in the center, and it starts to decrease in size. First slowly, 2, 3, 4, then faster and faster, and slows down again. So we start slow, fast, slow, and the ring starts slow, faster, fast, slow again. That's why we have a nice contrast, because we have a contrast of speed and spacing. Then we have a blink or a flash frame or whatever, and we want to keep the foreground elements. Then it concentrates into the ball of energy, and it starts to expand very fast. Well, it expands very fast in the center, but the rim of it is very slow for a frame, and then it's very fast. Then it slows down again, as you see. And the same thing with the ring. Starts slower, accelerates, slows down. Then we have the same thing in the center. So it starts like this, very fast acceleration, then it slows down even more, slows down even more, and even more, and even more. But we compensate it by having the masses going from the center quite fast. So even though the overall mass has stopped or slowed down significantly, the shapes in the center still have a lot of acceleration here. So it's like we have initial explosion, which is this orange sparky thing, and the pink ring. So this is initial explosion, then we have a secondary explosion, it slows down, then we have a third explosion, mass is going from the center here, then we have a fourth explosion, explosion number 4, which slows down, and then we have a very slow motion, and the fifth one just starting. And then it is further amplified by the shake. So it's a very multi-layered explosion. We have a lot of layers here. And that's why it works so well, because we have so many layers of interesting design and interesting motion. And and they always overlap. So everything doesn't happen at the same time. We don't get all 5 waves at the same time. They happen one by one, but each wave slightly overlaps the previous one. So by the time the new wave appears, the new element appears, previous element is already decelerating, but it hasn't stopped. That's what makes it interesting. Aside from interesting shapes and cool design, yeah. So that's why it works so well. So what's the problem here? What we don't have here? First, we don't have this contrast. So to make these impact frames work, we need an interesting design and a lot of contrast. So we don't have a dark background here, so even white stars don't stand out. The second thing is we don't have interesting forms and the position of the star shapes. If you look at this here, it's on the same line, and they're very similar, and you don't get this nice motion again. It's not very interesting composition, and you don't get this transition where we start like this and we get. So we start like this, more center shape, then we expand it. We expand it vertically and start expanding it horizontally, expand it horizontally, expand it vertically again. So it's essentially a squash and stretch, but with stars. Very strange squash and stretch, but still. And yeah, you see how we get bigger shapes, smaller shapes, very small shapes, and they always create somewhat of an interesting composition. We have a lot of variety here. While here, some shapes disappear way too quickly, and we don't always have a lot of variety. Again, we don't get this squash and stretch. It appears very stretched, then it goes and becomes very centered, then it stays in the same spot, then we suddenly stretch it and instantly switch it back. So we don't have enough time and enough space to make it more interesting and to realize its potential. Okay. Now, this frame lacks contrast, so I would make it darker, and we need something, we need details, we need stripes, we need something, even stuff like this. Like speed lines or anything could help it, could sell it more, because it's all about the motion of the dark and light spots. And in this frame, in these frames we don't get a lot of motion, so it's just a gray block. It doesn't move anywhere, the lighting doesn't change, and we don't get the contrast here, so that's why these impact frames don't work well. So it's better to study some of it. So for example, here we have some details. It's lit from this from this spot, almost with a flashlight, a giant flashlight or projector, or something like that. Then it's lit from this spot behind these trees, and then it goes back. So we see dark going here, dark going here, closer to the camera, and then it's going back again and stretches out. So that creates, first it creates motion to the camera and the light moving away from the camera, and then again it goes back. Next up we have this frame, and this lacks a bit of that interesting form. So it's kind of a form, it's kind of nice, but it's not very well defined. Obviously if you add some layers or add something to it, more defined shape here, so we've got a shape here, and then we add this kind of sort of things, so they still give us a sense of the overall form without these parts, instead of meshing with it and becoming one. So this is too indistinguishable from the overall form. We get a rhomb or this kind of shape instead of a heart. Okay, slower, faster, and here it should become slower and merge in one, and that works well, more or less. Then here we don't have volume, and the second problem is that you see we don't have enough contrast and we don't have enough volume, so all this stuff doesn't follow the form. So the overall form is like this, it's a sphere, but these parts completely ignore the fact that it's a sphere. They are not positioned in a way as to show that that's a sphere. So for example, and yeah, we can make it way brighter. And you see, I follow the sphere, I follow the volume. And if you want to show that volume, to show that it's not a two-dimensional object, you should follow some of that volume to add a sense that it's positioned in space, that it's not just some floating abstract scene, a flat abstract scene. So I use curve, and I curve it along the surface. And even smaller stuff, it's better to curve it along the surface to reinforce that idea of volume. Next up, the scene here again. Remember what I said? It got slow, so it's fast in the center, but it's very slow on the edges. That way we can still see the motion even if it's fast. And the problem here is that we cut directly from here to here. So everything moves fast. Everything. So this goes fast and this goes fast. And again, we don't get a spherical shape because everything is kind of very similar. Because here, if you look closely, we've got bigger shapes closer to the camera, and we've got very small shapes that goes over the surface. That helps sell the illusion of depth, as well as having this small stuff distributed along the surface. And if you look closely, everything here sort of wraps along the surface, so it still gives this nice shape, spherical shape. And here, yeah, we get particles here that move in their own way, and these particles don't wrap along the surface. This is the surface, and they don't exactly wrap alongside it. And again, we don't have these nice particles to break up the shape and not make it too repetitive, too ideally sharp. Because here it's got these sharp edges, and this makes it too clean, too artificial. Whereas here we've got smaller particles, we've got some edges here, but they're broken up by smaller particles, by this stuff, and by the way it's put here. Next up, again, it slows down here, so it's a slow, slow, fast, slower. And here we don't have this deceleration, so it accelerates and it still accelerates, and the particles increase in quantity. So we get more particles instead of these particles becoming smaller. And then they decelerate, but you use transform, so we don't get this nice sense of slow change of form. You can change the forms way more, and again, these small particles, they can die out, but these bigger particles then can turn into smaller particles. That way we don't make it too heavy, too overly detailed, because we, again, make some particles smaller and then just stop animating them. They disappear, and we only animate bigger particles. That's it. So next up, this purple form. So again, remember about the formula. We start accelerate here and decelerate from there. So again, we decelerate, 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 and we've got a nice interesting shape. It has some variety there. Everything is not perfectly symmetrical. We've got a mass like this, a mass like this, a mass like this, and it's not symmetrical. Here we've got this nice but symmetrical line. Everything here is symmetrical. And then it becomes way too bulky. We don't have any distinguished shapes. Everything is like a block. and it's a symmetrical one, so we've got two lines of symmetry. It's symmetrical like this and like this. Again, slow down, and you see we don't have a clean slowdown. Slows down, accelerates, slows down, accelerates. And then suddenly turns into particles. So there weren't any holes or anything implying the change or implying that it will break into particles before that. That's why it's a very sudden change. And again, it messes up the spacing because we're slowing down, even though this is not very defined, and then we suddenly accelerate again and slow down. And yeah, we just don't have enough consistency and a defined spacing and forms here. So on the last bits, it needs just a bit more consistent forms, spacing and stuff, because right now it doesn't have any contrast. It moves not consistently, but roughly at the same speed from this frame on. So it moves faster, moves smaller, slower, but overall it has almost the same rate, and that's why we don't get enough contrast, because we don't have a defined slowdown, and instead it switches on and off between deceleration and acceleration, and that makes it slightly less appealing. So I would think a bit about the overall shapes in the center and out on the sides. Again, define the spacing and define where it decelerates, when it accelerates, and what we want to do with it. Because here it's quite understandable. It starts small, accelerates, then we decelerate, and it's a long deceleration. Then this form appears, it appears quite fast, and then it starts decelerating. Then new form appears. It creates a very interesting shape, a lot of contrast, a lot of flower-like language, and then it decelerates. Then a new form, and the last one, appears from the center, creates an interesting shape, and starts decelerating very slowly. And that's it. It's a very interesting but a very complex in terms of layering. You can still do that if you look at your forms, check your contrast, and don't forget about the overall forms, spacing, and shape language. For example, here, all these forms are very similar, and the overall design is very symmetrical. It's like, it's a sphere. All in all, it's a sphere, and all this stuff is very repetitive. And the second thing is it doesn't follow the volume. So if it's a sphere, again, it should follow the volume. If it's not a sphere, like here, it's more of a flower thing, it still follows some kind of an arc across the surface. So for example, even with this kind of setup, we can do something less symmetrical. For example, something like this. Maybe add smaller bits to break it up a bit. And then use this funny, interesting purple layer to add some contrast, some other shapes. Again, trying to keep it interesting, trying to keep it less repetitive and less symmetrical, and having a definitive shape language. So everything should have some kind of shape language, and it should be somewhat defined. So hope that helps. If you have any questions, ask them in the chat. Tag me if you'll have any thumbnails for future animations, and good luck!